Hi everybody, this is Skylar here, and welcome to another episode of TMP, the Musical Puppy, and it's my second episode in my crash course on how to read music. As I said in the introduction, I'm doing a mini-series on how to read music. It's going to be a bit of a crash course, so it might have a lot of information in it, but you can stop and start it as you need. You can take notes, and hopefully you don't get too confused, but I'll try my best to make it as clear as possible. So in the last episode, I basically just introduced the staff and the 5 bar lines that are going to be your base for most instruments. Today's episode is going to be a little bit packed, as we're going to be talking about clefs, because that's pretty much where you have to start, because you can't really do anything until you understand clefs and how they work and how they affect the music that you're going to read. Like, you can put a bunch of different notes, like I'll just put whatever. But none of this means anything unless you have a clef, because this is meaningless. This doesn't mean anything. It's sort of like, you know, you have a bunch of different different words, but you don't know what language they're in. Like you could put a bunch of different words, like not in one sentence, but you wouldn't be able to really know what it means unless you knew what language it was, because sometimes some words look similar between different languages. So unless you know what language is, it's a little difficult to really decipher it. So what is a clef? Well, a clef basically just tells you how to read different notes. So if I reintroduce this bar, rewrite the staff. So I guess this one's gonna be a little bit long, and hopefully you can bear with me a little bit, because this is an important topic. So the first clef I'm going to introduce is the treble clef, sometimes called the G clef, and that's not quite an accurate statement, but for 99% of the time it's fine to call it the G clef, but it's more accurately called the treble clef. I don't know if some people call it the G clef because you can kind of see a G in there, but the reason it's generally the treble clef is a specific kind of G clef, and the reason the G clef is called a G clef is because the end of it shows you where G is going to be. Alright? So wherever you put it, this little tail ends on this line, and that's where G is going to be. So who uses the treble clef? Well, a lot of instruments use the treble clef. Basically, most of your higher instruments will be using the treble clef, like flute, clarinets, what else? Oboe, French horn will mostly use treble clef. Oops, that's not how you spell horn. Trumpet will use treble clef. Piano will use treble clef as well. For the right hand stuff, harp will make use of the treble clef. Violin. And also if you sing female voice parts, they often use, so like soprano, alto voice. These, there's a bunch of others too, but just the ones off the top of my head. These will most often use the treble clef because these are the higher notes. Treble is, represents higher. But so if you're planning to learn how to play one of these instruments, you should know how to read the treble clef for sure. However, if you do play other instruments that are the bass instruments, such as cello, viola, even that's not a bass instrument, but trombone sometimes too, bassoon sometimes, not so often. If the notes are high enough, they will sometimes write it in treble clef, so it's a little easier to read without having to go super high up. So you should kind of pay attention to this too and learn to recognize treble notes. So now I will draw out the staff so we can learn what the notes are, so you can kind of get a feel for how treble clef is read. Okay, so the good news is, no matter what clef you're reading in, notes will always go up in a sequential letter order from A to G. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and we'll start back over at A. So no matter what, as long as you can find one, you can work your way through the others. But it's a good idea to be very comfortable with the notes in your primary clef. So if you're playing any one of those instruments, this is a good place to start for you. So the good news about the treble clef too is that there's two very easy mnemonic devices we can use. So for the lines, these lines E, G, B, D, F, there's a few different things you can use. I learned as a kid, every good boy does fine. There's a couple different variations on that, but that's a good way to help you remember the lines. And the spaces, which are in between the lines, they have the mnemonic face, F-A-C-E. So I grew up on treble clefs, so that's how I learned it, and how I'm telling you, and how I'm teaching people now. So let's move on to the next clef. Okay, so the next clef that I'm going to introduce is the bass clef. Basically the second most used clef. I have already listed the a sampling of the instruments that use it, like bassoon, trombone, tuba, cello, bass, male voices, like baritones and basses. They will often read in bass clef. Timpani, I forgot to mention for the treble clef that some percussion instruments, like the pitch percussion, such as xylophone and all that, they actually use the treble clef. But I'll worry about that later. The left hand on piano and the left hand on harp will often be written in bass clef because they represent the lowest notes, most of the lowest notes that you can find on a staff. And just like the treble clef, the bass clef also has another name, well, a generic name. It's known as an F clef. And it's called an F clef because these two dots show you where F is going to be. So F is here. So now I'm going to notate the staff with the notes. Okay, so now I've written out the notes. I should make that B a little better. It wasn't such a good B. So I've written out the notes on the staff for bass clef. G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A. I don't know any good tricks for the bass clef like I do the treble clef. So if anybody has any good suggestions, please leave them down below. But like I said, if you remember that this is an F clef and the dots show you where F is, you can work out the rest, and if you just keep working at it, your muscle memory will take over. Alright, so now I'm going to move on to the next clef. So for our next clef, we have the alto clef. The alto clef is a bit unusual. It's kind of hard to handwrite. On the side here, I'll probably put like a printed version so you can kind of see what it looks like when it's actually written in music. But there's a couple different handwritten ways you can write an alto clef. Sometimes people write it as like a little K, kind of like this, or something like that. Sometimes in older music, it'll look that way when it's printed. It'll kind of look like a K. But right here, I'll put what it looks like in modern notation. And the only instrument today that really uses the alto clef is the viola. So you probably won't need to know this one too much unless you play viola. And sometimes trombone. In older trombone music, particularly when they're labeled as alto trombone parts, it's written in alto clef. But that's pretty rare. But the one thing about alto clef is that it's sort of easy to kind of find how to read it, because like G clefs and F clefs, these are known as C clefs, and you can probably guess why, because where the two like little bows meet is C, and it just so happens for alto clef that it's middle C. What middle C is like if you look at it like a piano, and it's got like the treble clef on top and the bass clef on bottom, there's a note right in between them which is middle C. And that'll be like your middle C on the piano. And that's what this C on an alto staff is. So let me go ahead and notate that for you so you can kind of see the notes, so you can make note of them. Okay. Alright, so this is how you're going to read notes if you're using alto clef. So viola players, have fun with that. Alright, let's move on to the last major clef that you're going to find in the vast majority of music that you'd find today. Alright, so the fourth and last major clef that I'm going to introduce is the tenor clef. It looks sort of like the alto clef, but it's moved up one line. And most likely you're not going to need to really know the tenor clef right away. It's for all the bass instruments, such as bassoon, trombone, sometimes tuba, particularly cello, sometimes contrabass, not so often, but it happens. And it's more like when you get into more advanced music, when it gets a little bit higher in the register. And again, it's just to make reading a little easier so you don't have to go so high on the staff. But it's good to recognize for now, and as you get more into your instrument, you'll see a lot more tenor clef music. And just like alto clef, this is going to be C. I believe it's also middle C, but it's just moved up one in the staff. That's just the way it is. I don't know why, but that's just the way it is. But I'll go ahead and write out the notes for you as well. Okay, so those are the notes written out for you. It's very similar to alto clef, just like I said, moved up one. Although that doesn't really help you too much, because you'll never need to read both alto and tenor clef at the same time. It just doesn't happen that way. But again, this is more for in the future when you get more into your instrument. You're not going to see very much tenor clef right away. But it's important to recognize it, especially if you play a bass instrument, so you don't get lost when you suddenly see it in your music. And it's mostly just like, I might have a lesson on this later on. I haven't really planned one, but like because I'm mostly doing for general all instruments. But if you go up, and then instead of continuing to go up, it'll drop down into tenor clef, but it'll be higher. But that's a little too far ahead of what I'm trying to get at here. But just recognize it for now. Know that you'll probably see it as you get more into your studying of your instrument. Like I said, there's a lot of other clefs, especially historical ones, but these are the four most important ones. But I do want to mention that there are two more that you might see. And I'll just show those off real quick. Going back to percussion, especially for non-pitched percussion, like drums, cymbals, triangles, where you're not going to have the different notes like A, B, C, D, because you just hit the instrument and it makes a sound. You just need rhythms. They will denote that with a little clef called the percussion clef, and it kind of looks like that. They'll use it on both, five-line staves, where you have multiple instruments on one, or if it's just a single stave for just a single instrument, you'll also see it there too. It kind of looks like two little lines, and that just means each note written doesn't represent a specific pitch. It's just that it's for a percussion instrument or instruments. So that's all I have to say on clefs. Now that we know how to read music in certain contexts, now we can keep building on that. So I hope that wasn't too much information, but hopefully it was helpful. Maybe you just watched the section that was appropriate for the instrument you're trying to learn, or maybe you're just trying to learn it all and have a general knowledge of how to read music. So thanks for watching, and please come back for next time as we cover the next topic on my crash course on how to read music. If you have any questions, you can leave them down below, any comments. Like I said, if you ask a question that I'm not already covering, I'll gladly make a video or work it into one of the videos if not already answering it. But I welcome any and all questions, so please feel free.